The front doors of the prestigious Ravenhall Auditorium towered like a monument to everything that kept him out. Marble columns, gold-trimmed glass, and guards who didn't blink twice before deciding who belonged and who didn't. The boy, no older than 15, rolled up in a weathered wheelchair, his hoodie pulled tight over his head, the edges of his pants slightly frayed, his shoes scuffed, but his hands firm on the wheels and his expression unreadable. He stopped at the main entry, alone, no entourage, no invitation card swinging from a lanyard, just a digital ticket glowing on his phone screen and eyes that had seen too much too young. The security guard saw him from 20 feet away and already started shaking his head. "No, no, no," he muttered before the boy even spoke. The boy calmly held up the screen. "I have a ticket." The guard didn't look. "Medical entrances around back," he said, waving him off like a fly. "This is for guests." Another guard leaned in and smirked. "You sure you're not just lost, kid? This isn't the community center." Laughter from behind the rope barrier, murmurs from bystanders. One woman in a long white dress whispering something to her husband, who nodded while never breaking eye contact with the boy. The boy didn't flinch. "It's a premiere," he said. "Public event. I signed up. I got confirmed." The first guard walked closer, crouched just enough to make it look like he was being gentle. "Listen, kid. I don't know how you even got here, but trust me, you're not on the list. You think we're letting you roll in there like that, dressed like that? Look around you." And the boy did look. At the velvet carpet, at the polished shoes, at the way no one would meet his eyes for more than a second. He had been here before. Not this place, but this moment, where dignity was offered like a favor, and people like him had to earn their place twice just to be ignored. Still, he said nothing, just held up his phone again. The screen read, "Admit 1, VIP evening entrance, row A." The guard scoffed and leaned in closer. "Is this some kind of joke? Someone dare you to pull this off? You think you're making a point?" But before he could say another word, the automatic doors behind him hissed open with a soft click, and every head turned. Someone had arrived. The kind of arrival that bent conversations, that changed the mood of a room. The boy didn't look, not yet. But the guards straightened. People behind the barrier gasped. Phones lifted. A pair of polished shoes stepped out from a black car, and as the figure approached, tall and commanding in a charcoal grey suit, the guard's face turned pale. The man said nothing at first, just looked down at the boy in the wheelchair and then up at the guard, his expression sharp, controlled, unreadable. And then, with deliberate clarity, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Is there a problem with my son?" The silence that followed the man's words hit harder than any scream, hanging in the air like a held breath, suffocating and sharp. The guard's face twitched. The confident smirk wiped away like chalk under rain, and for a moment his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just a stammered exhale, eyes flicking between the tall man in the suit and the boy in the wheelchair whose face remained stone still. The second guard, who had laughed earlier, stepped back instinctively, mumbling something about checking the guest list, but the man didn't even glance at him. Instead, his attention was fixed like a blade on the first guard who had blocked the entrance, now visibly sweating under the sudden gaze of consequence. "I asked you a question," the man repeated slowly, his voice low but cutting. "Is there a problem with my son?" The guard cleared his throat, trying to recover. "No, sir. We were just making sure he belonged here." "Belonged," the man echoed, and the word was now heavy with weight. "And what exactly does someone have to look like to belong in your eyes?" The guard stammered again. "We didn't know who he was. We just thought—" "You thought wrong," the man snapped, not raising his voice but sharpening it like steel. Then he turned slightly toward the boy, who had still not spoken, still not blinked, still holding the same digital ticket in his hand, as if it were the last piece of dignity he refused to let go. The man took the phone gently from him, held it up for the camera crew now hesitantly filming from behind the velvet rope, and said clearly, "Row A, VIP, confirmed. The only thing wrong here is your assumptions." The boy finally looked up at the guard, not with anger, but with something colder, disappointment, exhaustion. Something deeper than rage and harder to erase. "You didn't even ask my name," he said quietly. "You just looked at me and decided I wasn't worth the door." His words were quiet, but they landed like thunder, and the crowd that had gathered, the well-dressed audience waiting to be seen, now stood in guilty silence. A few people pulled out their phones. One woman turned and walked away quickly. Another whispered to her friend, "I thought he was with the school program or something." And that whisper was exactly the point. He was never seen as someone who belonged. Not here, not in a place built for the polished and the privileged. The man stepped forward again. "Do you treat all young black boys in wheelchairs this way, or just the ones without someone important standing behind them?" The guard's mouth opened, but there was no defense. There was nothing to say. He'd said enough with his body language, with the tilt of his voice, with the way he had looked past the boy like he was just part of the sidewalk. The man didn't wait for an answer. "Move," he ordered simply, and the guard stepped aside, not daring to challenge him. The boy rolled forward slowly, and for the first time, the red carpet seemed to part for him. The cameras flashed now, not just for the man, but for the boy, though he didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply moved forward with the same quiet control he had arrived with, only now the world had no choice but to look. But as he passed through the doorway and into the grand entrance, he knew what had just happened wasn't justice. It was only a glimpse of how fragile his place really was. He hadn't earned respect. It had been borrowed from the man behind him, and deep down, he wondered what would have happened if that man hadn't shown up at all. The moment the boy crossed the threshold of the entrance, the warmth of the grand hall wrapped around him like a lie. Golden lights, soft music, polished floors. But it couldn't erase what had happened outside, and it couldn't stop the looks that followed him with every turn of his wheels. He felt them immediately, sharp and calculated, not loud like the guard's voice, but quiet and crawling like whispers slipping under skin. Eyes that scanned him not with welcome, but suspicion, curiosity, and subtle disgust, the kind that didn't need words to make their meaning clear. People moved aside not out of respect but discomfort, like his presence reminded them of something they didn't want to see, something imperfect, inconvenient, and entirely out of place in a room tailored for wealth, white skin, and polished perfection. A man near the bar leaned toward his companion and muttered just loud enough for the boy to hear, "I didn't know they were letting in charity cases tonight." A woman with gleaming pearls and too much perfume glanced down at him and pulled her purse tighter against her hip, as if he might steal it without ever leaving his chair. Another guest stared openly at his hands, calloused from pushing wheels for years, and whispered, "Where's his nurse?" The boy said nothing. He didn't respond, didn't look back, didn't react, because he'd learned that reacting only confirmed their expectations, only fed the image they already carried in their heads, that he was angry, out of control, ungrateful. So he stayed silent. But silence wasn't the same as peace. Inside, his chest burned, not with rage, but with something more dangerous, resentment sharpened by repetition. This wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. They saw a black kid in a wheelchair and immediately made assumptions about his intelligence, his worth, his origin. Every glance said, "You don't belong here unless someone important says you do." The man who called him son had disappeared into a crowd of executives, shaking hands, commanding the room like a general among soldiers. And with him gone, the boy could feel the space around him begin to constrict. A waiter passed him by without offering a tray. A hostess looked at his chair and asked sweetly, "Do you need directions to the accessibility seating?" as if he couldn't possibly have a front row ticket like the rest. And then came the stares again. Those eyes that didn't just look at him, but through him, around him, beyond him, like he wasn't a person at all, just a symbol, a side note, a mistake in a room full of choreography. Someone stepped on his wheel, another brushed past and muttered, "Excuse me," as if irritated by his presence. The boy stayed still, forcing his breathing to stay slow, steady, even as his hands clenched the rims of his wheels so tightly they turned white. He wanted to scream, not out loud, but in a way that would force them to feel what it meant to be erased in plain sight. He had a ticket. He had a name. He had every right to be here, but none of it mattered. Not his achievement, not his invitation, not his quiet dignity, because the moment they looked at him, they had already decided who he was. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes for the room to shrink around him like a cage. 5 minutes for 1,000 eyes to strip him down without ever asking a question. 5 minutes to remind him that the door might have opened, but the welcome had never really arrived. Let's take a short pause in the story. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this in your own life? We'd love to hear your story. And if these moments speak to you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now we continue. The music inside the hall played softly, a string quartet tucked into the corner performing for people who weren't really listening, who were too busy pretending not to notice the boy in the wheelchair weaving between them like he was some unexpected glitch in their perfect evening. Every time he passed a group, conversations paused. Not out of respect, but that tense, awkward silence of people trying to act polite while their minds screamed the opposite. One man chuckled under his breath, nudged his wife and said, "Is he part of the entertainment?" Another woman whispered, "I thought this event was by invitation only," and her friend replied, "Maybe he's with the diversity program." The words weren't meant to be cruel. That was the worst part. They were said with that polished, practiced tone of casual elitism, wrapped in smiles, delivered with perfume-laced breaths, cruelty disguised as conversation. The boy felt each comment as if it scraped across his skin. Invisible bruises that no one else could see, but that bled all the same. When he reached the designated section near the stage, he was stopped by an usher, young, clean-cut, trying hard to sound professional. "Excuse me, sir, this section is reserved." The boy lifted his phone. "Row A," he said simply, showing the screen again. The usher squinted, blinked, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I see. Sorry. I just didn't expect, well, please follow me." The pause said everything. "I didn't expect you to belong here." The boy was placed at the end of the front row, not centered like the other VIPs, but just close enough to be visible, just far enough to not be counted. His view was partially blocked by a floral arrangement. The seat next to him, marked reserved, remained empty. The event hadn't even started, and already he felt exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally, drained by the constant effort it took to simply exist in a space that kept trying to erase him. He could still hear the voices from outside, still see the look on the guard's face, the moment of panic when he had walked in. And then, as if summoned by thought, the man appeared, the one who had called him son. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone born into applause. Tall and polished in a suit tailored so perfectly, it looked like a second skin. People stepped aside for him. They didn't question his place. They knew who he was. A billionaire, a media mogul, a symbol of American power and legacy. And the moment he arrived, the entire atmosphere shifted. Smiles bloomed. Eyes sparkled. Hands reached out for his handshake like it was currency. The boy watched as people who had ignored him 5 minutes ago now pushed past him to greet the man behind him. The man smiled for the cameras, posed with donors, exchanged empty compliments with strangers who would sell him out in a heartbeat if it bought them another inch of clout. But when his eyes met the boy's, something changed. The smile softened. He crossed the floor in 2 strides and sat in the seat beside the boy, never saying a word about the flowers blocking their view, never asking if the boy was okay, because he already knew. But even seated beside someone that powerful, the whispers didn't stop. A man in the second row leaned toward a colleague and said, "I didn't know he had a black son." Another asked, "Is that a publicity move? Adoption is trending again." And somewhere in the back, a woman said loud enough to be heard, "Such a shame he has to deal with all that baggage. That poor man." Baggage. The word hit like a slap, and the boy felt his chest tighten. He wanted to scream, to stand, to tear down the velvet banners and glass smiles and ask every single one of them what made them so sure they were better than him. But he didn't. He sat still, silent, cold, because that's what he had been taught. Because in rooms like this, even your breath could be considered a threat if you let it shake too loud. He looked at the stage, where speeches were about to begin, and then at the man beside him, the one whose shadow protected him, the one who made this place open its doors, the one who gave him safety without ever meaning to give him belonging. And the boy thought, not for the first time, they only see me because of who stands behind me, not because of who I am, not because of what I've done, just because of him. And something in him hardened, because respect borrowed is never real. And one day, he knew he'd have to walk through a door alone, and they'd slam it in his face all over again. The room buzzed with an undercurrent of excitement. Every corner of the hall was filled with conversation, laughter, and the kind of polite clinking of glasses that only wealthy people could manage. The boy sat in his seat, hands gripping the wheels of his chair so tightly that his knuckles began to turn white. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the endless stares that darted between casual glances and the quiet, veiled judgment. His presence here was still a spectacle, still a disruption in the carefully constructed order of things. The man beside him, his father, the mogul who had offered him this chance, was too busy for him now, lost in the tide of people who approached him, shaking his hand, greeting him, flattering him with compliments that sounded rehearsed. The boy had never liked this world of hollow smiles and exchanges meant to mask the ugliness underneath. The speeches began, the lights dimmed, and the focus shifted to the stage. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes on the podium, where a powerful white man was speaking about the state of the industry, about the future, about the good they were all doing in the world. The boy tried to focus on the words, but it was hard to concentrate when he could feel the weight of the world pushing down on him. He was an outsider here, and no matter how much he tried to blend in, no matter how many times he adjusted his posture and held his gaze steady, they saw him for what he was, a charity case, someone who had been allowed to walk through the door only because of who his father was. He could hear a few whispered remarks from behind him, some too soft to catch, others loud enough to make his stomach churn. I heard he's adopted. The voice was smooth, like it belonged to someone who had always been a part of this world. Such a shame, right? I mean, he could have had anyone in the world, but he chose well, you know. The boy stiffened but didn't look around. He knew what they were saying. He could feel the undertones of every word, the disgust wrapped in pity, the way they tried to mask their bigotry with the guise of concern. He was never really one of them, not in their eyes. Another voice chimed in, this time softer, more hesitant. But he's so different, don't you think? I mean, look at him. He's not what I expected. The boy could almost picture the look of fascination on the speaker's face. They weren't even talking about him as a person anymore. They were talking about him as if he were an exhibit, something to gawk at and analyze, something to marvel at from a distance while never truly acknowledging his humanity. He clenched his teeth and forced himself to focus on the stage. The man's voice on the podium carried on, a familiar cadence of corporate language, speaking of progress and success, of opportunities for the privileged and those fortunate enough to belong to this circle. The boy's hands shook slightly, not with nervousness but with the weight of the realization that everything they were saying was a lie. This world, this carefully crafted illusion of inclusivity and equality, was built on lies. It was built on systems that favored the rich and the powerful, that gave people like him just enough space to keep them in line, but never enough to allow them to thrive. And yet, the more they spoke about progress, the more it became clear to him that they weren't talking about people like him. They were talking about themselves, and anyone who wasn't exactly like them was merely a footnote in their narrative, a token, a prop to be used when it was convenient. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a man standing in the aisle, just outside the circle of wealth and privilege that surrounded the table. The man was dressed in a sharp suit, but his face was unfamiliar. He didn't belong here, not in the way the others did. He was black, and his presence felt out of place among the sea of white faces. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't belong, like he had wandered into the wrong room by mistake. He glanced around, clearly aware of the eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. His gaze briefly met the boy's, and for a split second, the boy saw something flicker in the man's eyes. Recognition. Not of who he was, but of what he was. Another outsider. Another person who wasn't supposed to be here, but was. The boy wanted to stand up, to shout, to make everyone hear him. He wanted to scream about all the years he had spent fighting to prove his worth, to show that he wasn't just a token, just a distraction to fill a quota, but instead he sat there quietly, the weight of his own voice pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. He didn't belong here. He never would. And yet, here he was, sitting at a table meant for the powerful, the privileged, the ones who had everything handed to them just for being born into the right family, the right skin. As the speeches continued, the boy's mind wandered. He thought about his life before this, before the invitations, before the opportunities that had come only because of who his father was. He thought about the nights he had spent on the streets, begging for scraps, being ignored by the world that passed him by. He remembered the cold, the hunger, the way people looked at him then, just like they looked at him now, as if he was nothing more than a problem to be ignored. And yet somehow, his survival had been a testament to something deeper than just his father's wealth. He had made it through the darkness, through the pain, through the invisible weight of racism and discrimination that had followed him his entire life. But even now, with all the privileges he had been handed, he was still reminded every day that he wasn't truly seen, that he was still nothing more than an accessory to a world that didn't want him in it. He was still just the son of a powerful man, nothing more, nothing less. And as the evening dragged on, the whispers around him grew louder, more insistent. People were talking about him again, their words slipping between the polite conversation like knives. Did you hear? He's actually been in some big documentaries. Must be quite the project for his father. He's not really, a part of it. A laugh. It's all just charity, isn't it? The whole thing. He's a charity case. Each word cut deeper than the last, and the boy's fists tightened in his lap, the pain of being seen as nothing but a commodity rising in his chest. He tried to ignore it, tried to block it out, but the words kept coming, relentless. Charity case, project, not really part of it. They didn't even see him. Not really. His father was deep in conversation now, shaking hands with the kind of people who made decisions about who got to live and who got to die, who had a future and who didn't. The boy knew this. He knew the power they held. He knew what his father could do, what he had done. But that power wasn't his. It never had been. His father had given him everything, but the world had never cared. And so, as the night wore on, the boy sat in silence, his body still, his mind racing. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stand it, how much longer he could pretend to be someone's trophy, someone's prize for being the right kind of person, the right kind of symbol for the world to admire. The whispers grew louder. And this time, the boy knew he wasn't just going to sit there. He wasn't going to let them talk about him like that. Not anymore. He wasn't just a charity case. He wasn't just the son of someone important. He had a voice. And one day, they would hear it. But for now, he stayed silent, waiting for the moment when he would finally be seen for who he really was. As the evening continued, the glamour of the event began to wear thin, like cheap fabric pulled too tightly. The boy, still in his seat, could feel the pressure of every glance, every whisper, like invisible hands squeezing the air around him. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that he would do something, say something that would shatter the carefully curated perfection they had so painstakingly built around themselves. He was just a flaw in their immaculate world, something that didn't fit, but had been reluctantly allowed in because of his father. Nothing more. The boy's eyes remained fixed on the stage, his body stiff, but his mind was far from the grand speeches unfolding before him. His father was no longer at his side. He had been swept away by the same people who had ignored him since the moment he entered the building. The room was filled with important faces, each person more self-assured than the last, all discussing things that didn't concern him. Wealth, politics, investments. They spoke of their power as if it were a currency that only they could trade. He was just another symbol of their benevolence, another object of their charity that made them feel like they were doing something noble. But he wasn't their charity. He wasn't their project. He was a person. He had always been a person, but in their eyes, he was invisible. At one point, a woman approached his table. She was well dressed, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her red lipstick the perfect shade of confidence. She glanced down at him with the kind of smile reserved for people she deemed worthy of her attention. "Is this your first event?" she asked, her voice light and playful, as if they were sharing a secret. The boy didn't answer right away. He had heard these questions before, the questions that were meant to remind him that he didn't belong here. "Is this your first time at something like this? Isn't it nice to be treated like this, just for one night?" It was all patronizing, all designed to make him feel lucky for being invited, to make him grateful that someone like her, had extended an invitation. But he wasn't grateful. He was furious. He was tired of being treated like an outsider, like an exception to the rule. Instead of responding with a smile, he simply met her gaze, his eyes cold, unflinching. She faltered for a moment, as if the stare had knocked her off balance. "I'm sure you're enjoying the night," she said, trying to recover, but there was an edge in her voice now, a shift. "I'm not sure why you're asking," he finally replied, his voice steady. "Do you want to know if I'm comfortable in this room, or if I belong here?" The woman's smile faltered for just a split second, and for the first time, the boy saw a crack in the facade, the mask of politeness that everyone wore so carefully. "Well, I didn't mean to—" "But you did," the boy interrupted. "You meant to remind me that I'm out of place, that I'm here because someone like my father gave me a seat at the table. I'm not supposed to be here without that, am I? I'm not supposed to be at the front with the rest of you. I'm supposed to stay in my place. That's what you meant to say." The woman's face flushed, but she didn't say anything else. She turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply as she walked away, leaving him alone again in the seat that had been given to him, but not earned. The boy felt a mixture of satisfaction and anger settle deep in his chest. He hadn't apologized for speaking his truth. He hadn't shrunk away like they expected him to, but it still wasn't enough. He still wasn't enough. And just as the evening was dragging into its predictable cycle of polite conversation and shallow pleasantries, the boy's father returned, flanked by a couple of his colleagues. The man's presence, as always, was magnetic. People gathered around him, their faces lighting up as they tried to get his attention, their voices raising in excitement. But the boy wasn't looking at his father. He wasn't even looking at the people surrounding him. He was watching a man in the corner of the room, a man who had been standing quietly, observing everything. The man was older, dark-skinned, his clothes simple but well-tailored. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room with an intensity that made the boy pause. There was something about the way he carried himself that felt different from the rest of the crowd. He didn't belong here either, but in a way, he was exactly where he was meant to be. And for the first time since entering the hall, the boy felt the smallest flicker of recognition. The man's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, the boy felt seen. Not as the son of a billionaire, not as a charity case, not as an outsider, but as a person, as someone who had fought for every inch of his existence. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he wasn't invisible, like there was at least one person in this room who understood what it meant to be different, to be treated as less than. The moment passed quickly, and the man turned away, his attention shifting back to the conversations around him. But the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted in the room. The whispers, the subtle glances, the whispers that had been so constant. They had stopped. For a moment, the boy wasn't sure why. Had they seen the same thing he had seen? Had they felt it too? He didn't have time to dwell on it, because just then, his father approached, his smile wide and his hand extended. "You're still here, huh? You must be enjoying yourself." The boy knew the smile. He knew it well. It was the smile of a man who had everything in the world, who had been born into the privilege that the boy would never have, no matter how much he succeeded, no matter how much he fought. It wasn't a smile that offered any real warmth. It was a smile of ownership, of someone who owned not just wealth, but the very world around him. "I'm fine," the boy replied, trying to keep his voice steady, trying to force the mask back into place. He wasn't going to ruin the night for his father. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him upset. Not when he had made it this far. but the words burned in his throat. A fire that he couldn't quench. A truth that was beginning to feel heavier with each passing minute. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of conversations and hollow pleasantries. The boy's presence was acknowledged only when it was necessary. Only when someone had to make a quick show of their charity, their ability to allow someone like him to exist in the same space as them. He didn't belong here, not in their eyes, not in any meaningful way. And as the night drew to a close, the boy found himself alone again, standing in the shadows, watching the people around him as they continued their celebration, their laughter ringing in his ears. They had all forgotten him already, he realized. They hadn't really seen him, not as a person, not as someone with his own story, his own fight. He had been nothing but a brief diversion in their lives, a moment to make them feel good about themselves. But that would change. He would make sure of it. The boy wheeled himself toward the exit, and as he did, he caught a glimpse of the man from earlier, standing by the door, watching him. This time, the boy didn't look away. The man gave him a nod, and the boy nodded back, a silent understanding passing between them. And in that moment, something inside the boy clicked. He wasn't just going to sit there anymore. He wasn't going to let them treat him like a footnote. He would find his voice. He would make them see him. One day, they would know his name, not because of who stood behind him, but because of who he was. The days that followed the event were a blur. The boy tried to immerse himself in the world his father had carved out for him, the world of luxury, power, and exclusivity that felt more like a gilded cage than the freedom it promised. Every day was another reminder that no matter what he accomplished, no matter what he achieved, he would always be looked at as less worthy, less deserving, less real. The whispers followed him everywhere, at school, at social events, even in the halls of his own home. They clung to him like a second skin. It had been a week since the gala, but the sting of that night had not faded. He replayed every glance, every comment, every glance that looked over him like he wasn't really there. He knew that despite everything, despite the people who had smiled at him just for his father's sake, they never saw him as one of them. They saw him as an accessory, a project, a way to show how progressive and inclusive they could be, while still holding tightly to their places of power. And that gnawing feeling, that constant ache of being invisible, had only grown stronger. He found himself avoiding his father more, trying to push away the part of him that still wanted approval, that still wanted his father's love despite everything. His father had given him so much, opportunities, privileges, an education, but none of it seemed to matter, because no matter what he did, his father was still the one people respected. His name was the one that carried weight, not his own, and the boy was tired of it. He was tired of existing in someone else's shadow. It was a Friday afternoon when everything changed. The boy had just finished his last class of the day and was making his way out of school when he saw a group of his classmates gathered outside the main doors, their laughter loud and unrestrained. At first, he tried to ignore them, but then he heard the familiar sound of his name being tossed around like an insult. "Hey, it's the charity case. What's the matter, kid? Can't even walk on your own?" He stopped in his tracks, his stomach sinking. The words hit harder than he had expected, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight back or just disappear. But before he could react, one of the students, a tall boy with a smug smile, walked up to him, his eyes narrowing with mock pity. "I thought you'd be hanging out with your dad's friends tonight," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You know, the important people. But I guess you're just here with us normal folks, huh?" The group of students behind him snickered, their eyes darting between the boy and their leader. The boy clenched his fists, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. He hated this feeling, hated how they could strip away his dignity with just a few words, with a few looks. He hated that his father's name wasn't enough to protect him from the cruelty of the world outside. But instead of saying anything, he just stood there, his breath shallow, fighting to keep his composure. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He had to be stronger than that. He had to show them that he wasn't their joke, that he wasn't just some symbol of their charitable good deeds. But the more he stood there, the more the weight of his silence felt like defeat. And then, just as he thought he might finally snap, a voice called out from behind him. "Hey, is there a problem here?" He turned to see a man walking toward them, a man with the same sharp eyes, the same commanding presence that had cut through the room at the gala. The boy didn't recognize him, but there was something about him that felt familiar, something that made the air around him feel lighter, even if just for a moment. The students shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to react to this new arrival. The boy's heart beat faster, and for a brief second, he thought about what he might say to the stranger. But the words didn't come. The tall boy who had been mocking him smirked and stepped forward. "Who are you, man?" he asked, his voice full of bravado, but there was a hint of uncertainty now, something that made the boy feel a flicker of hope. The man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the students. "I'm someone who's tired of watching people like you make others feel less than. So if you don't mind, I'll be taking him with me." The tall boy scoffed. "What? You think you can just walk in here and—" "Walk in here?" the man interrupted, his voice firm but calm. "I'm not walking in. I've been here long enough to see how you treat people who don't look like you. How you treat people who aren't on your level. And I'm done. So if you don't want trouble, you'll step aside." There was a tense silence. The tall boy's smirk faded as he took a step back, his bravado crumbling in the face of the man's confidence. The other students followed his lead, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether they should intervene. But none of them spoke. None of them dared to challenge the man. The boy, still in shock, looked at the man who had come to his rescue. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, unsure of what had just happened, of why this stranger had decided to step in. The man looked down at him with a mixture of understanding and resolve. "My name is Marcus," he said simply, "and I've been watching. I know what they're doing to you, and I won't let it continue." The boy felt a wave of emotion wash over him, something between relief and disbelief. This man had seen the way he was treated. This man had recognized the injustice he faced every single day, and he had done something about it. He wasn't just standing by, pretending nothing was wrong. He was taking action. "I've been there," Marcus continued, his voice softening. "I know what it's like to be treated like you don't matter, to be reduced to nothing more than a token or a charity case. But that's not who you are. You're more than that, and I want to help you see that. But you have to believe it first." The boy looked at Marcus, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and confusion. He had never heard anyone speak to him like that before, not like he was more than just a part of someone else's narrative, not like he mattered for who he was. "Come with me," Marcus said, offering a hand. "Let's get you out of here. It's time for you to start seeing yourself the way the world should." For the first time in a long time, the boy hesitated. He wasn't used to this kind of offer, this kind of kindness, but he was tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of being ignored, tired of always having to fight for his place in a world that kept trying to shove him aside. He looked down at the hand extended toward him, and for the first time, he reached out. As he took Marcus's hand, he felt the weight of everything that had held him back, everything that had tried to keep him small, begin to lift. Maybe it wouldn't happen all at once. Maybe it would take time. But for the first time, he felt like he was stepping into a world that didn't just tolerate him, but saw him, recognized him. And that was a start. Marcus led him away from the crowd, past the whispers, past the judgment, and towards something that felt like freedom. The boy knew, deep down, that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be more battles, more pain, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, he wasn't facing them alone. And for the first time, he knew his voice would be heard. The days following Marcus's intervention were strange for the boy. The weight of what had happened lingered over him like a fog that wouldn't lift. He had never felt this kind of raw, unfiltered sense of injustice before. Not in the way he felt it now. When he walked down the streets or sat in class, he felt it in the way people looked at him, the way they moved around him, as if they were afraid their space would be invaded. It wasn't just about his wheelchair. It wasn't just about the color of his skin, though that certainly played a part. No, it was about something deeper, a sense of entitlement that others had, a sense of belonging that was never extended to him. The whispers had not stopped. They never would. But now, they were louder. They were more pointed. Every step he took, he felt as though he were being watched, judged, as if his every movement was being analyzed. It was exhausting. The constant pressure to remain calm, composed, to wear the invisible armor that he had worn his entire life. He could feel people shifting their eyes away as he passed them in the hallways, could feel their discomfort as if it were a tangible thing, something that could choke him if he let it. But this time, it was different. This time, he refused to let it choke him. He was back at the school where everything had started, where the stares had first begun, where the whispers had first cut into him like knives. But this time, he wasn't walking into the building with his head down, hoping to be invisible. He wasn't trying to fit in or shrink himself into the small, neat boxes they wanted him to stay in. No. This time, he was going to show them. He was going to make them see. But that wouldn't come easily. It never did. As he rolled into the school courtyard that morning, his mind was filled with a mix of determination and dread. He knew that the eyes would follow him again. He knew the comments would come. But he also knew that he had something they didn't. He had strength. He had a reason to keep going, even if it was just for himself. He was going to take that power back, piece by piece. He wasn't going to be anyone's token, anyone's charity case. He was going to carve out his own space in the world, and if they didn't like it, well, that was their problem, not his. But the first hurdle came quickly, as it always did. As he rolled into the hallway toward his locker, he saw a group of students gathered near the lockers. Their voices were low, but not low enough for him not to hear them. "Look who's here," one of them said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What, no bodyguard today? Guess we get to see the real him." The others laughed, and the boy's stomach churned. He didn't need to turn around to know who had spoken. It was the same girl who had mocked him at the gala, the one who had smiled at him with that thin veneer of politeness, pretending that they were on the same level. The boy took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. He could feel the familiar knot in his chest, the desire to snap back, to put them in their place, but he knew better now. He had learned something that night, something important. They wanted him to be angry. They wanted him to react, to give them something to laugh at. But he wouldn't give them that. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he kept moving, focusing on the sound of his wheels against the polished floor, the rhythm of it grounding him, reminding him that he had the power to choose. He could choose not to respond. He could choose to rise above them. But just as he was about to pass them by, the girl spoke again, louder this time. "What's the matter? Don't like to talk to people like us?" The others snickered, and for a moment, it felt like the air around him was closing in, suffocating him. The weight of their stares pressed on him, heavier than before. They saw him as other. They saw him as less, not just because he was in a wheelchair, not just because he was black, but because he didn't fit into their neat, perfect world. It took everything in him not to stop, not to turn and say something, anything that would shut them up. But he couldn't. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them get under his skin, so he kept moving, even as their laughter followed him down the hall. It didn't matter that they were still talking about him, still whispering behind his back. What mattered was that he wasn't going to let them have the power to hurt him anymore. He was done letting their words define him. As he reached his locker, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He froze. He turned to see Marcus standing there, the man who had stepped in for him before, the man who had shown him that there was a world beyond the whispers, beyond the narrow confines of what people wanted him to be. "I saw what happened," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, his gaze calm but intense. "And I know it's not easy, but you've got something they'll never have. They can't see it, but I can." He paused, looking the boy in the eye. "You're stronger than they'll ever understand. And one day when they see you rise above all this, they'll regret the day they ever made fun of you." The boy didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected Marcus to be here, hadn't expected him to know what had happened. But in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. The weight that had been crushing him, the weight of all the hate, all the judgment, all the racism, began to lift, just a little. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. "You don't have to fight this alone," Marcus continued. "I know what it's like to be treated like you're invisible. like you're just a prop in someone else's story. But trust me, you have a story of your own, and it's not over yet. The boy's throat tightened, and for a moment he didn't trust himself to speak. He wasn't sure if he could hold back the flood of emotions that had been building up inside him, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. But Marcus was right. This wasn't over. He wasn't just some side note in someone else's life. He wasn't going to let them define him anymore. He wasn't going to be invisible. As Marcus walked away, the boy turned back to his locker, his hand resting lightly on the cold metal. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. It was going to take time. It was going to take work, but he was done hiding. He was done playing by their rules. It was time to play by his own. And that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he made a promise to himself. He would rise above it all. He would make them see him, and he would make sure they never forgot his name. The weeks that followed Marcus's intervention and the boy's decision to take a stand were filled with contradictions. On the surface, things appeared to be settling down, at least in the eyes of the people around him. The students who had whispered behind his back at first had grown accustomed to his presence. They no longer mocked him openly, though the undercurrent of their disdain was still present. It lingered in their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking, in the way they steered clear of him in the hallways, like his presence was a contamination they didn't know how to deal with. It wasn't as overt as it had been before, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. And it did. The boy had been invited to another event, a conference this time, where influential people in the city came together to discuss education reform. It was a prestigious gathering, one of those affairs that was attended by the city's elite, politicians, philanthropists, and the kind of people who wore their power like an invisible cloak. He had received an invitation, as usual, with his father's name as the endorsement, and it felt like an unspoken condition. Come along, but don't forget why you're here, just like the last time, just like always. This time, he had been determined not to let it bother him. He was going to show up, sit through the event, and leave, just like the others. But what he didn't expect was the way his presence would be met by the same subtle disdain he had come to recognize so well. As he rolled through the entrance of the conference hall, his wheelchair wheels screeching on the marble floor, he immediately felt the difference. The moment he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. The polite applause that followed the others as they entered had been replaced by uncomfortable silences, the kind that made his stomach twist with a mixture of anger and shame. People looked at him with that same expression. They didn't know what to do with him. The way they fidgeted in their seats, the way they turned away when their eyes met his. He felt it all. The room was full of high-powered individuals, the kinds of people who made decisions that affected entire communities, the kinds of people who had the power to change lives with a single phone call. Yet in their eyes, the boy was still just the son of someone important. Not important himself. No, he wasn't seen as a person. Not yet. Not ever. He was a reminder of something they were uncomfortable with, something they couldn't quite put into words, but that hung in the air around them like a disease. The unspoken truth that people like him didn't belong in spaces like this. As he found his seat at the back of the room, he caught sight of his father speaking to a small group of donors. The man had that same confident smile, the one that charmed everyone around him, that made people believe he was more than just a wealthy businessman. He was a savior, a man with the answers. The boy couldn't help but resent him for it, even though he knew it wasn't his father's fault. His father had done nothing wrong. It was the world around him that had failed them both, that had turned a blind eye to everything that mattered and everything they were. It was the world that was broken, not his father. And yet, the boy couldn't shake the anger that bubbled up inside him. The conference began, and for the most part, the boy tried to tune it out. He listened half-heartedly to the speeches about education and inequality, but he could hear the condescending undertones, the way these well-meaning people discussed issues they couldn't possibly understand. The panelists spoke of diversity initiatives, of the need to address inequity, but their words rang hollow. He knew these people, these powerful, privileged individuals, would go back to their pristine offices and forget about the problems they had discussed here. They would make their donations, write their checks, but they would never change the system that kept them in power. They would never truly understand what it was like to live in a world that had already decided your worth before you were even born. As the discussion continued, a woman standing at the front, a politician with perfectly coiffed hair and a bright smile, spoke passionately about how important it was to give back to the underserved communities. "We must ensure," she said, her voice dripping with sincerity, "that every child, no matter their background or circumstances, has the opportunity to succeed. We must fight for equality." The boy clenched his jaw. She didn't see him. She didn't see the millions of children who, like him, had to fight tooth and nail for a seat at the table, who were dismissed by people like her for being too difficult or unpalatable. He had lived that life. He had fought for his seat, and yet he knew this woman had never seen him as anything more than an opportunity for a soundbite, for a photo op. She wasn't fighting for him. She wasn't fighting for people like him. She was fighting for her own power, for the illusion of progress. As she spoke, the boy felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a man standing next to him, dressed in an expensive suit, his face blank, almost robotic. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man said in a voice that was too polite, too rehearsed, "but I believe you're in my seat." The boy blinked, taken aback. He looked down at the seating chart in front of him. His name was clearly written on the paper just beside the empty chair. He'd been assigned this spot. But the man didn't look at the chart. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the boy, his posture rigid, like he had every right to demand this seat, like the boy was the one who didn't belong. The boy started, but the man cut him off. "You're not in the right place," the man said, his voice growing slightly firmer, "and I don't think you should be here at all." The words hung in the air like a poison, thick and suffocating. The boy's chest tightened, his heart racing. He could feel the eyes of the room on him again, like they were waiting for him to make a scene, to do something that would make them feel justified in their assumptions. He knew what they were thinking. They were all thinking the same thing. You don't belong here. They were all waiting for him to prove them right. He had two choices. He could stay silent, as he had done so many times before, and let them continue to erase him, to treat him like a nuisance. Or he could speak up, take the seat that was his by right, and face the wrath of everyone who had made it clear they didn't want him here. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but for the first time in his life, he didn't hesitate. He met the man's eyes with a coldness that surprised even him. "This is my seat," the boy said quietly, his voice steady, "and I'm not moving." The man blinked, clearly taken aback by the boy's defiance. He opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, another voice intervened. "Is there a problem here?" The boy's father stepped up beside him, his presence filling the space like a sudden storm. The man in the suit visibly stiffened, his face flushing as he took a step back. "I'm sorry," the man muttered, his voice now tinged with embarrassment. "I must have misunderstood." The boy's father didn't acknowledge the apology. He simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and guided him back into the seat, the weight of his influence hanging in the air, a reminder that his name was still the one that commanded respect. The boy sat there, feeling the bitterness rise in his throat. His father's name had once been a shield, something that protected him from the harsh realities of the world. But now, it felt like a shackle, holding him in place, while the world continued to pretend he was nothing more than a reflection of someone else's success. The rest of the conference was a blur, the words and faces blending together in a haze of false promises and empty platitudes. The boy didn't listen anymore. He couldn't. All he could hear were the echoes of that man's words. "You don't belong here." The night ended, and the boy left the conference early, not because he had to, but because he couldn't bear another minute in that room. He left through the back exit, his wheelchair rolling silently over the cold pavement, the sounds of the city outside filling his ears, but the weight of the evening still clinging to him. He had come to the event with the hope that things might change, that he might finally be treated as an equal. But the world had shown him, once again, that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as something less. But he wouldn't stop. He wouldn't let them win. He wasn't just his father's son. He was more than that. And one day, the world would see that. He would make them see. The days that followed the conference blurred into one long, exhausting cycle. The boy tried his best to pretend he wasn't affected by the events, but no matter how hard he tried, the sting of humiliation never quite left. Each glance from his peers, each comment made in hushed tones, each brush-off from those who had previously treated him with fake kindness. It all compounded into a weight he could no longer carry. He had always believed in his father's world, the world of power, influence, and opportunity. His father's name had opened doors for him, had given him access to places and people most would never dream of. But now, in the hollow aftermath of the conference, the boy felt nothing but emptiness. His father's name had never truly been his. It had always been a shield, a tool for the world to use. He had spent his whole life trying to prove that he was more than just a reflection of that name, more than just a piece of someone else's legacy. But with every dismissal, every sideways glance, every whisper, the boy realized something. No matter how hard I try, they will always see me as nothing more than the sum of my father's name. He couldn't breathe under the weight of it. He couldn't escape the feeling that the world was constantly looking at him, not as a person, but as a symbol of something they could easily discard once they were done with it. It was during one of these dark days, as he sat alone in the quiet of his room, his mind swirling with the same poisonous thoughts that had consumed him for months, that something inside him snapped. He had been silent for so long. He had let them control his narrative. He had let them strip away his humanity by not speaking up, by not demanding to be seen for who he really was. But not anymore. Not this time. His phone buzzed on his desk, a simple notification, an email from a local news outlet, a reminder about the upcoming community event where his father was scheduled to speak. The event had been sold to the public as a progressive move toward racial equality and inclusion. The boy had heard his father's speeches, seen the media campaigns, and even though he had to sit there and watch his father bask in the adoration of people who never really saw him, it had always felt hollow. His father didn't know what it was like to be in his shoes, to live a life where everything was decided for you based on your skin, your background, your circumstances. But this time, the boy decided he would go, not as his father's son, but as himself. He wasn't going to wait for the world to acknowledge him. He was going to make them see him, see who he was, not just who they thought he was. He had spent too long being invisible, too long waiting for approval from people who would never care. The time had come to show them that they could not erase him. The night of the event arrived, and as his father gave his speech, the boy watched from the side of the stage, the familiar words about progress and change falling from his lips, the crowd clapping, cheering, hanging on to every word. But this time, the boy didn't feel proud. He didn't feel inspired. He felt suffocated by the weight of the lies that his father's words were only meant to perpetuate, not challenge. As the applause died down, the boy stood. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and the room fell silent. His father paused mid-step, as if he hadn't expected to see his son rise. "Where are you going?" his father asked, his voice strained with confusion. The boy didn't answer. He simply wheeled himself into the crowd, ignoring the stares, the gasps, the whispers. He could feel every eye on him, every judgmental gaze. But he kept moving forward. He didn't need to justify himself anymore. He didn't need their approval. He had already proven more than they ever could understand. The boy made his way to the stage, not in the shadow of his father, but in full view of everyone present. He was tired of being behind the scenes. He was tired of waiting for people to see him. Tonight, he would speak. He would make sure they heard him. Standing in front of the microphone, he paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could feel his father's presence, tense and unsure behind him, but he couldn't afford to look back. He had to do this for himself. The boy cleared his throat and began. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Michael Thompson, and I've been sitting in the shadows for far too long. I've been invisible, discounted, and told that I don't belong here. But I'm here to tell you that I do belong here. Not because of the name on my birth certificate, not because of the man standing behind me, but because I am me. I've earned every breath I've taken in this world, just like every person in this room, and I will not be erased anymore." The room went silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. His father stood at the back, his face a mix of surprise and something else, embarrassment perhaps, or maybe guilt. Michael didn't know. He didn't care. This wasn't about his father. It was about him. It was about making a statement, taking back the control that had been stripped from him his entire life. Every day, I've been told who I am, who I should be, and what I'm allowed to achieve. Not because of my abilities, but because of the color of my skin, because of the wheelchair I use, because of the life I was born into. You all sit here pretending to care, pretending to be inclusive, but you don't understand the weight of what you're doing. You give charity, you give recognition, but you don't see us. You don't see me. His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through it. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being told that I'm lucky to be here. I'm tired of being treated like I'm here because of someone else's kindness, someone else's privilege. I am not a charity case. I am a person, a human being with a name and a story and a life that matters. And so are the millions of people who are treated like they don't belong in spaces like this. People who look like me. People who live like me. People who have to fight every single day just to have a seat at the table. He paused, his chest rising and falling with the emotion that had been building up inside him for years. For the first time, he felt like the weight was lifting. Not because the crowd was listening, but because he was finally saying the things he had always been afraid to say. I'm done being silent. I'm done hiding behind the privilege of others. I'm done letting people like you decide my worth. My name is Michael Thompson, and I belong here. The room was deathly silent for a long moment, and for a split second, Michael thought he might have just made a huge mistake. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that were sure to follow, the judgment that would be passed when he left. But something unexpected happened. The applause began slowly, almost hesitantly at first, but it grew louder and louder until it was deafening. People were standing now, clapping, acknowledging him, not as his father's son, but as Michael Thompson, a young man who had stood up for himself and for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. Michael didn't look back at his father. He didn't need to. This was his moment. He had finally been seen. And as the applause rang in his ears, he realized something. He had spent his whole life trying to fit into a world that didn't want him. But now, he was done fitting into their world. He would create his own. And they would all have to see him. They would all have to hear him. We hope you found this story impactful. What do you think about the journey of Michael? Have you ever faced situations where racism or discrimination played a part in your life? We would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments. You are incredibly important to us, and we truly value every single one of you. Your support means the world. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories. Have a great day ahead, and if you listened all the way to the end, leave a comment with the phrase "I am seen," so we know you stayed with us till the very end.